using that book there. I managed to get that from the second-hand bookstore for $5. So you don't have to pay a lot of money to get these great books. Now, so the idea is that these talismans, these ancient charms or objects, were sort of bridges between us, you know, we're the inferior, we're the ignorant, we're the earthly ones, and a bridge to the divine world with its spirits representing the sky and fire and day and night and death and life and all that sort of thing. And so by weaving them into the carpets in the simplest form at all, then you might be begging for protection or help. I'll give you a good example. There's a so-called crab design in a lot of tribal carpets. It doesn't actually look much like a crab, but it's meant to represent the crab that's also in the zodiac, because you know a whole lot of Persian, I might slow down now, a whole lot of Persian concepts, got to keep reminding me, actually go right back to ancient Babylon, ancient Sumer. You know, they're the ones that came up with the idea of the zodiac and the concept of everything being divided into 12. So the crab is terribly important. But what a lot of people think is what we see as a crab design, and it's pretty geometric, because they couldn't actually do curved designs until the 16th century. Do you realise this? If you're looking at anything that's rectilinear, so that it's got sharp angles, even though it's trying to represent some round animal or some round thing, that's because it's pre-16th century, or it's representing pre-16th century designs. Actually very hard to weave anything that doesn't look rectilinear. You know, so curvilinear is actually a more recent thing and quite hard to do. So if you do a crab with sharp angles and straight lines and things, it doesn't look much like a crab. It looks a bit like a spider. And in fact, some of them are spiders. And what they often weave in is the tarantula. Now, if you've got arachnophobia, you'll be in trouble now. They actually, the tribesmen, particularly the nomadic tribesmen in the wilderness, in the deserts, really revere the tarantula because it's so powerful, and they feel that they actually worship it and ask it for protection. So some of those so-called crab designs will actually be tarantula designs, so be warned about that. Some of them are just so, as I say, stylised that we just can't pin them down anymore. You know, their representation's really been lost in the mists of time. Some of them, I say, have been stylised over time a lot, and a lot of them, as I say, are rectilinear rather than curvilinear. So, you know, what you ought to do is just approach each carpet, go to a really beautiful showroom. There's a very nice one in Northbridge. I happen to live on the lower North Shore. Really large one. I shouldn't give an ad, but it's owned by a man called Bijan. And the thing about it is that it's large. A lot of carpet places are very small and they're stuffed full of carpets, and you don't really get a good look. If you want to look at a place that has them on the walls and you can really view them at your leisure with beautiful lighting and so on, this might be a good place to start. And so what you'll end up having a look at is carpets, and just approaching each one and seeing what you can see in there. Ask the carpet dealer as much as you possibly can. I'm sure they'd love to fill you in and maybe even offer you a cup of Persian tea, which they should really do. All right. Now, the earliest carpets, as I say, owe a lot, we think, to Sumer. Just about everything owes a lot to ancient Sumer. And we know that, that this goes back this far because we have a terracotta seal, which goes back around about 500 BCE or BC. It's in Iraq today. And it's got two weavers represented on this terracotta seal, and they're weaving on, but it's on a horizontal loom. Now, we think horizontal loom means flat weave. So either knots being tied or perhaps a sort of shuttle, okay? So that sort of weave. That is not what we would call a Persian carpet today. You realise Persian carpet today is individual knots. Do you realise that? That if you've got 30 knots to the square inch, 30 knots vertically and 30 knots horizontally, that's 900 knots per square inch. And that is pretty much the extreme end, upper end of them. And each one of those knots has been tied individually. This is the amazing craft. This might mean that it might take, even with two weavers, 5 years to do, up to 10 years to do. This is the amount of investment these people are putting into these. And this is why, you know, it seems such a shame when places like these have stock take sales and knock off 80% of the price. I mean, you know, what you're often looking at, to my mind, is priceless. It's a huge amount of commitment and labour, and particularly in ancient times where even getting the colours right, getting the spinning right was so difficult. You have to appreciate the provenance of something like that. So not carpets per se, go back, as far as we know, only to the Paseric carpet, which I'll talk about. There is a description of knotted carpets in Aristophanes' The Wasp. This is around 400 BC. We think that the very earliest carpets actually owe a lot to a fleece such as the one I've just shown you, or perhaps a sheep's fleece. Because if you think about it, the original floor coverings, and don't forget they were always hung as well, but the original floor coverings would have probably been a pelt, wouldn't they? They would have been the fleece from the sheep or the goats or even the donkey or whatever. And that would have meant that there was a covering on the floor, something a little bit warm to sit on, and hopefully a little bit soft to sit on. So they would have left the fleece as long as possible, and that would be very comfortable to sit on. Winter and summer, I have to say. These things are cool in summer as well as warm in winter. You have to be aware of that as well. That's the thing of natural fibres, okay, over synthetic fibres. And you know, if you go to a Persian carpet showroom, you must only talk about hand-woven, natural dyed carpets. Don't even look at the others, right? Okay, so, and what they would have done is, first of all, use that. Then they might have shorn the goats or the lambs and got quite long hanks of wool and decided that if they put down a warp and a weft foundation on a loom, and looms are basically very simple frames, and they often were originally small enough just to be packed up and put on the back of your horse so that they were mobile, so the nomads we know did this. And you just tie that hank of wool, leave it nice and long. That way the finished carpet is nice and thick, just like the pelt, but it has the advantage over the pelt in that you can dye that wool and end up with pretty colours. And then you can actually dye the wool and arrange those colours in artistic designs. And then you can actually make those designs represent sacred objects. So this is your dynamic. Just like that drinking cup I think I talked about when we did Ancient Persia Part 1, the first rhytons are drinking cups, but they're horn-shaped for a good reason. The first drinking cups were horns, okay? And that was the functional phase. And then they started to make them out of tin or bronze or gold or silver, and they started to decorate them. That was the pretty phase. Then they made that decoration incredibly beautiful. That was the artistic phase. And then they put on winged objects and so on and had special significance in the artistry, and that was the sacred phase. And that is when you're starting to layer your artistic goods with a whole lot of interest and meaning, such as we expect from any artwork today. So that happened with carpets as well. You see my point? The carpets are works of art. They are not commodities. They are not items of decor. I sometimes go to showrooms and people walk in and say, I want a carpet to match my curtains. And you sort of worry a little bit about someone who has that sharp appreciation of something so wonderful, but there you go. So, so this is what they did with fleece, and they left, much like flaccati rugs. You know, was it the 70s when I think every household had a flaccati rug with its long hanks of wool? And then they realised that at some point that if they could actually shear that wool right down, the finer the better, they could get a very specific, very detailed design with a lot of resolution. And how beautiful was that? To the point where it's just the artistry today is absolutely exceptional. And that's when they started to shear them down with special tools that look for all the world like a very sharp small sickle. They actually shave it back like that after they've done about this much, shave it back, and then that gives them the access to the next lot, and then they get a very sharp tool and shave it right down as far as they possibly can. And you can think that the finer the fibre, the lower you can shave it and still get a lovely gloss, but a lovely thin carpet. You know, the hardest thing to do is to get a beautiful thin carpet with a beautiful drape about it. This would have been a very difficult thing to do. This would have been a decorative carpet rather than a carpet to walk on. And there you go. The picture just fell off the wall. And you can imagine that, you know, a thin carpet, such was collected by Henry VIII obsessively and used as tablecloths, for heaven's sake. It is said in Iran that the thinner the carpet, the richer the man, because it means that you've got a very fine fibre, probably silk, and a very fine artistry, very tight knots, and it was shaved very, very fine and hangs absolutely beautifully. So that is one of the many sayings around carpets. So that's what you've got then. Now, the first carpet, as I say, was a Pazyryk. I mentioned it when we did ancient Persia because we looked at the Scythians, and this was found in Scythian territory. The Pazyryk comes from the Pazyryk Valley. It's not actually a town, but it's an area on the border of Russia and Mongolia and Kazakhstan today. It was found in 1949. I did tell a story, but I'll just recap, that the reason that something perishable was able to be preserved in absolutely magnificent condition, about 2 metres by 3 metres in size, was that the tomb was broken into, filled with water, froze solid, because we're looking at frozen tundra areas here, for the next 2,500 years. Froze solid. So that when it was found in 1949, all the perishables were in perfect condition. And these are the ones that usually perish. So this is just an amazing thing. And this was in a burial mound. When I say mound, these are these underground chambers that have a bit of a mound and then grass grows on top. Terribly hard to find until quite recently. And these are called kurgans. And this one, this particular carpet, had a knot count, and it was in wool. Okay, so sturdy wool. But very modern in that it had a very high knot count per square inch, and we still do talk about knot counts in square inches, of 225 knots per square inch. Now, for an ancient culture, that's not bad, particularly given that up until recently we've thought that the Scythians were fairly primitive peoples. I think we've now revised that, the idea that nomads must per se be primitive and barbaric and a bit basic and a bit rustic. We're starting to revise that to see that they used technology which was often just entirely appropriate to their needs, and where they needed sophistication, they either did the sophistication themselves or they commissioned it. They're often quite wealthy. Nomads have access to luxury goods, that is flocks and wool and things like that, and often the Scythians had access to gold. And whatever they wanted, they could commission. And they commissioned, we think, this carpet from the Persians, or the Persians commissioned it from them. We're just not quite sure. It turned up in a Scythian monarch's tomb. And what we think is that it has got Persian influence. Possibly it was made in Persia for a Scythian, for the shroud, for this Scythian king or chieftain, because it does have some Persian influence. It's got 8 pointed stars, for example. You might remember me saying that goes right back to the Star of Ishtar. It's got griffins. A griffin pretty much looks like a lion with an eagle's head. It's got elks and horsemen. Now that's very Scythian. And my theory is that it is somehow the product of the cooperation between these two peoples, the Scythians and the sometimes called Scythians, and the Persians, who are often only represented as being at war, but in fact must have done a lot of trade as well. So it's probably time to show you a little bit about this carpet, to show you the carpet itself. It's quite a good